Good morning, and I start with two apologies. The first is that, yet again, you're going to have a presentation in English, and the second is that I stand between you and lunch. Richard has explained the changing circumstances of evaluation, and what he's talked about and the evolution of that plays absolutely into the evolution of evaluation and measurement in government communications in the UK, and Richard has been very deeply involved in the work that we've been doing. We have around 4,000 people in government communications in 17 central government departments like mine and 330 agencies. That's 4,000 people that we know of, because I'm sure you found in your organisations that there are people doing communications with different names who spring up all over the place. One of my jobs is to bash them down and to ensure that we have professional communicators and not people who just think they'd like to have a go. The salary for these 4,000 communicators alone is 1.8 billion kroner, and on top of this we spend around 3.7 billion kroner a year in paid-for marketing. In 2010, when there was a change of government, we were spending an awful lot more than this. We had more people and we spent about 6 billion kroner on advertising. And yet, when the new government came in, we could not explain to the ministers how many people we had, how much money we spent, what we spent it on, and whether it made a difference. Which brings me to this quote, which is quite famous in the niche evaluation circles from John Wanamaker, and this is the situation we found ourselves in. It's not that we didn't believe that what we were doing was adding value, but we didn't have any hard evidence to prove it. We didn't properly measure and evaluate the work of government communications, and given the scale of the costs involved, this was quite shocking. But it's not uncommon in the communications sector, whether in the public sector or in the private sector, to do a lot of communications activity and spend a lot of money without really knowing what value it adds. When I joined the UK Tax Authority in 2011, this was really important for me, because we were facing budget cuts, pressure on the workforce numbers, and questions, serious questions about what value my function added. My department, because it collects tax, is so utterly reliant on data and evidence. It was my view at the time that I couldn't rely on guesswork and assertion to prove the worth of the communications department in HM Revenue and Customs. I needed to be able to justify the work of communications using measurement and evaluation to demonstrate our effectiveness in the language that my colleagues understood. Now, I'm not the first person ever to try to measure the value of communications in government. And we, in HM Revenue and Customs, had a lot of measurement, but we weren't necessarily measuring the right things. As Richard was talking about, we were looking at the vanity stuff. Press offices were measuring how many press releases they issued, how many column inches they got in national newspapers, how many minutes of broadcast, radio and television broadcast, they secured on radio and television. Social media was measured in Twitter followers and opportunities to see. Advertising was measured in the recall awareness of marketing campaigns. Internal communications was measured in terms of the number of hits on an internal message on the intranet. We still measure this because it's important, but it's not enough. Because we were, as Richard said, missing two big things out. The real business objective of the communications activity, and they must be smart objectives, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And secondly, the business outcome of the communications. So in my own department and across government, we were setting communications objectives which weren't directly linked to the business objective of the organisations. We were setting activities as objectives and measuring the reach of those activities, rather than measuring the outcomes and impacts of these activities against the hard business objectives. So, for example, in my own tax authority, we run a big campaign every year. There's a deadline of the 31st of January. We need 11.5 million people to file their tax return by the 31st of January every year. The business outcomes are measured in the number of people who complete their returns by the deadline, because those who miss the deadline are likely to owe tax, and it costs us a lot of money to chase them with debt recovery officers. Secondly, we measure, the objective is the proportion of these 11.5 million people who file their tax returns online rather than do it by post. That's because the cost to us of processing digital tax returns is a fraction of the cost of manually processing the postal returns. And thirdly, an objective is the number of people who call our helplines. It costs an average of £5 per call to handle. And the fewer calls we receive, the more money we save. But also, the fewer calls we receive, the lower the demand we have, the faster we answer the other calls, which improves our customer service performance metric overall. So we need to make our communications objectives specifically linked to these organisational objectives and apply the same rigour to everything we do in communications to ensure that we're focused on supporting the business. So we started to do this in my department. I wrote a communication strategy which focused on the business priorities. It was quite simple. I looked at the department's business plan. This is the stuff that HMRC wanted to do. And then I looked at where communications could influence the outcomes and said, well, these are the things that communications will help with. Because I have many mantras, but one of them is that communications doesn't exist in its own right and for its own sake. We only communicate to secure an objective and an outcome. And if there isn't one, we don't communicate. So we just linked everything directly to the strategic objectives. And we developed a hub in which we measured and monitored a wide range of inputs, outputs, outtakes, and outcomes. We can now clearly demonstrate correlations between our communications and, for instance, the filing rates of tax returns. We still measure Twitter, engagement, we still measure other useful outtakes that Richard talked about, but we don't communicate just to make people aware. We communicate to make aware people do something, and there's a very big difference. This improved rigour has been spreading across the government communications network, and in 2012 I led a programme of reform to establish government-wide evaluation and measurement framework, and we've been continually refining it ever since, with the help of Richard and other colleagues from outside government. It's part of a wider programme of communications professionalism reform, which aims to increase capability, efficiency, effectiveness, and to demonstrate to the government ministers that what we do adds value and delivers results. So I'll talk a bit about this cross-government reform and evaluation. And we've done two big things to improve the rigour of planning and evaluation in government communications. First is to establish a campaigns framework, and second, to establish an evaluation framework. The campaigns framework we call OASIS. We could call it anything, but it's an acronym that we invented, and it stands for Objectives, Audience Insights, Strategy, Implementation, and Scoring. And by scoring we mean evaluation, but E didn't really work as an acronym. So we wanted a simple framework that would help communications teams of all levels to understand the component parts of a campaign. I've already spoken about the need to align communications to policy and organisational objectives. Audiences is about understanding who the target audience is, where they are, and how best to reach them. It's about demographics, geography, media consumption habits, social media use, and any behavioural insights that we have. This will then inform our strategy, the above-the-shoulders stuff that Richard mentioned. Which channels should we use? How do we use them? When do we use them? Do we run a zero-cost campaign using owned media and free social media, or a low-cost digital campaign, or a full-cost, all guns blazing television, radio, everything marketing campaign to reach everyone in the country. It also helps us to decide whether to run a campaign at all. In my department, it might mean reviewing some of the outputs for which we're not directly responsible. So I have in my department 50 million individual customers and 5 million businesses. And the people who work on policy send millions of letters out every year. And those letters are written by technically brilliant policy people who can quote legislation and technical standards very happily. Unfortunately, those technical and legislative standards are not in plain English. And so what often happens, and I'm sure you've had letters from your own government, you get a very long letter from a government department which is legally correct, which is accurate, and which you don't understand. And so you pick the phone up and you call us, and then we can't answer the phone because too many of you are calling us, and then our call performance targets go down, and then the media pick up that our call performance targets have gone down, and then we get called before a parliamentary committee to explain why our call performance targets have gone down, which the media then report that we've been lambasted by a select committee in Parliament because we've got poor media performance. And it all came out because someone sent a really, really rubbish letter to 10 million people. So what we did is took it away from the policy people and rewrote it in plain English and gave it back and said, they just need to know, I need to know something, this is the basics I need to know, I can get more information online, and this is what I need to do. And we took out all of the extraneous stuff that they thought was necessary, and isn't, and put it on the web with a clear link to it. And blow me, but the number of calls we got for very technical and difficult things started to go down because we were able to demonstrate to the policy people that if you write in plain English just what someone needs to do, they're more likely to do it than if that is buried on page 5 of a very long legalistic letter. So we also might use trusted third parties to reach audiences instead of ourselves, because sometimes we're not the right people. But insight doesn't just help us to target our communications effectively, it also helps us to push back on those colleagues who rush to the glitzy, shiny output and say, we want some of that, please. So can we have some posters? Can we have a TV campaign? Can we put a video on YouTube? And that's where they start. And we say, so who's your audience? How do you know that they're on YouTube? How do you know they're going to watch this 25-minute video of a 50-year-old man talking into an auto cue for more than 30 seconds? And so we're able to use the insights to say, your audiences aren't on YouTube, and they're not going to watch this, and so let's not waste our money. Let's reach the audiences where we know they are, when they want to be communicated with. And it saves money. Implementation is about putting the clear plan and timetable in place, allocating resources, and basically the tactics of the campaign. And then the scoring is the evaluation. And we made this mandatory across government. And one of my team members who worked for me went out on loan to the Cabinet Office, which is a central bit of our government, and has been there for the last 2.5 years helping to implement this across the whole of government. And we had 4 things to deliver. To develop an evaluation framework and visual dashboards, and I'll show you one in a minute, to improve evaluation capability among staff, to design evaluation training and make it mandatory, and to develop a centre of excellence to promote best practice. In this initial framework we developed, we identified 3 tiers of things that we should measure. Things we must have, things that we should have, and things that would be nice to have. And in departments which were doing almost no measurement, we focused on the must-haves. And we regarded doing something better than nothing as a good first step. And we only at this time sought to measure 4 things: media, reputation, marketing, and employee engagement. We published a framework with some standard metrics. It was quite rudimentary, but it was a start. In my own organisation, this, what looks like quite a complicated thing, we've got a wall of metrics, which I developed for two reasons. One, to baffle the policy people and the people who counted the money, to show them that we could do this and that they should continue to employ my team. Secondly, to measure the effectiveness of campaigns by putting multi-channels together against actual outcomes. And thirdly, to measure the channels themselves, media, social media, engagement and such like. So we could see how we were doing throughout an entire channel and then also across channels on a campaign. To improve capability, we developed an evaluation competency framework. And that's for staff, and it had a 3-tier training course, foundation, practitioner and advanced level. We established a network of evaluation champions, people in every department who came, had masterclasses and went back and evangelised, or we hoped they would evangelise. And we set up an evaluation council, and that brings people from government together with academics, expert practitioners, including Richard, who sits on it with me, and from data-driven companies like Google and Facebook. And we use this council both to improve our own understanding of developments in communications evaluation and as a forum for practitioners to come to seek advice and challenge. It's an X factor for communications evaluation. We've spent the last 18 months refining our original framework, looking at best practice, building in the Barcelona Principle update, and the end of last year, we published a new framework, which I think is as good as you're going to see anywhere in the world at this time. And this slide will look complicated, but it's not. What we've got at the top is organisational objectives. And those lead directly into the communications objectives. Then we'll use our audience insights in our OASIS campaigns model to set out the inputs, the plans, preparations, research, testing and production of communications content, the outputs, the communications activity that we actually deliver, the outtakes, how audiences feel and think, measured by their awareness and understanding, the outcomes, the effects of that on their behaviour, and then finally the impact, on the organisational impact, which links back to the organisational objective. So what did they actually do after all of this stuff took place? Because you could have maximum awareness and no activity, no action, which is a complete waste of time. What we want is people to do things. And so those organisational outcomes could be cost, revenue, number of phone calls, whatever it is. And throughout any campaign, real-time measurement and evaluation should feed back to make adjustments as you go. We also, alongside this framework, we produced a handy guide to make it as simple and as easy to follow as possible. And we've got this quick reference guide, which is a bit like a paint colour swatch. And you can, for each of the channels, you've got inputs, outputs, and such like. And anyone can have it on their desk and then just look through and have a quick and easy guide to it. In my last few minutes, in a little bit more detail, but very quickly, I'll show you what this... here we go. So, for instance, for media, we would have inputs, planning and costs, content creation, and such like. The outputs will be the target audience reach, the message penetration, the number of media articles and broadcasts. Outtakes would include audience awareness, sentiment, engagement, click-throughs, shares, and such like. And outcomes, advocacy, attitude change, behaviour change, return on investment, and then the organisational impacts themselves, the stuff that goes back to the objective, what did they do at the end? So that's where we are in UK government. We have come an awful long way. We've developed an evaluation framework, which I think is a strong one. We've made measurement and evaluation mainstream and mandatory. We've got a much stronger focus on smart objectives. We've got training and knowledge sharing through evaluation champions. We've embedded the best practice. We've got a peer review of experts through the Evaluation Council. And finally, we can demonstrate to government ministers with hard evidence, in a way we never could before, the value of what we do. We've brought rigour to UK government communications. Now, we still have a long way to go. We all have a long way to go. to develop the absolutely brilliant smart measurement that will help us to save even more costs. But the progress we've made over the last 4 years has been absolutely integral to raising the professionalism, the respect, and the influence of government communications in Britain. And everything that I've talked about today is freely available on our website, the GCS website. It's very difficult to print off one of these fans, but the framework behind it is there, and the guidance. It's all free, because we feel that as a government department, as a government, we're spending taxpayers' money in doing stuff. We may as well give it to taxpayers to use themselves. So go to the Government Communication Service website and help yourselves. Thank you very much.
Okay, Stephen.